state of Indiana as I can, Stan.
Between the first declaration and the one that's likely upcoming from all of these storms, any idea how much money the state will be asking for in total from the federal government to help make Hoosiers whole?
Sure. Well, when we talk about asking for money, we know up front what we're asking for when it comes to the public infrastructure because we actually go out and do those estimates. So we're looking at approximately $10 million right now in public infrastructure damage. As far as the homes, we're out there still inspecting the homes. What we look at is we try to reach that trigger or that threshold of about 200 homes that have been major or destroyed, which people, it makes them inhabitable. So that's our trigger, that's our threshold, and it's difficult to put a dollar sign on that one, Stan.
All right, well, I need to move over to our WFIU radio booth and Sarah Whitmire for her guest this evening. Sarah?
Thanks, Stan. I'm joined in the studio by Dave Campbell. He is with the Army Corps of Engineers. And I want to begin by just talking to you about flood damage reduction. That's one of the major goals of the Army Corps of Engineers. So can you talk about what happened at Monroe Lake and at Patoka Lake?
Basically what happened is we held water to prevent downstream flooding on the East Fork of the White River, which runs into the Wabash, that runs into the Ohio, that runs into the Mississippi, and Patoka runs into Patoka River and then runs into the Wabash. And basically we had, as was noted earlier in the segment, that we got a lot of rain. We held the water, and we held the water as long as we could, and we finally reached what's our emergency spillway crest and actually exceeded that, and so you have water flowing through the emergency spillways instead of going over the top of the dam. It's kind of like it's an overflow safety feature that's built into our dams so that it'll bypass going over the top of the dam, like what happens with some of the levees. If they get over top, they get washed away. This stops that. It goes through and bypasses the dam and goes back into the creeks.
Can you describe the decision-making process that goes into this? How do you decide we're going to take this measure?
Well, part of it is there is no decision because it's Mother Nature. If it gives you, 400% greater rainfall than has ever been provided in April, that has an impact. But also the decision is not made here locally. It's made in a whole watershed sort of setup, which is, as was noted, the lower Ohio, as Mr. Shipe said, the lower Ohio, Mississippi, and so forth that got hit. And so you basically had the entire watershed from basically the Gulf of Mexico all the way to the upper end of Monroe Lake got lots of rain. And so we're holding back, but you still have downstream flooding. The decision's made in concert with a lot of other projects because we're not just by ourselves here. We have to look at what's going at other projects and on the rivers and so forth, because we are just at one control structure on a small drainage area, which is like 400 square miles, which covers like five counties. But we're providing water that goes into a place that covers all of southwestern Indiana. So that's a small amount when you start looking at all the acreage.
How do you prioritize, though, and determine that one community is going to get flooded over another community?
Well, again, for Monroe, the small amount of water, although specifically for Salt Creek, it's a large amount. But basically, that was how the lake, why the lake was constructed in the first place, was flood control. It actually goes back to the 1937 flood that occurred all along the Ohio. And that's why these lakes were constructed, to help control that. And one of the items is if the lakes hadn't been here, the equivalent water would have been 13 feet of water across the whole metro Louisville. And again, we don't flow that direction. We flow into the Wabash, down past Evansville, into Mississippi and so forth. But they're looking, that's why they've had to make decisions in other locations to determine, do we flood farmland or do we flood towns? And that's where a lot of the decision making gets being made. Monroe was designed to flood up to a certain elevation, but what happens is you get all that rain, it doesn't have a chance to make it all the way down the lake. It's in the creeks. We have a situation where you've got basically a big flood hose or fire hose putting into the lake, and we've got a garden hose to let it out.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. So Stan, back to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Al, I wanted to start with you and base my first question off of something you just heard Mr. Campbell say. I'm thinking about how you sort of do the math on all of this. So we've got all this standing water, and we've got this water table, and which is above limestone and karst topography and things like that. How much water can typical land in south central Indiana hold before it just is past the point where it can absorb any more and we need to have dry days and there's no solution other than sunlight?
That depends based on the time of year. We're fortunately in the time of the year when the sun is length, and at the longest time of day, the vegetation is all out, so it takes up the moisture in the ground very quickly. Typically, I'm going to estimate it takes roughly 2 to 3 inches of water to saturate the soil mantle, and then it'll start running off. Obviously, we've had that kind of rain very frequently this spring. It would take roughly 7 days of no water, no rain for what water is just in the river now to pass into the Ohio River from our area here, and then the rivers would start to recede, which they were receding before we got into this latest rain spell about 2 days ago. Fortunately, we see the pattern going the other way. We have a pretty high confidence starting Memorial Day. We're looking at temperatures approaching the 90s. We're looking at dry weather lasting probably 6 or more days. And with the sun being high in the sky, things on the hills will start drying out pretty fast. Unfortunately, the river bottoms are going to take a little bit longer. And it may be only soybeans in the river bottoms this year.
I'm glad you mentioned crops. Don, I wanted to ask, we've talked about the possible economic effects to farmers who are not able to get some of their crops into the ground as early as they might have. Do you often see that there is lasting damage from flooding to farmland? You own a bunch of farmland in the Vincennes area yourself. If you have floods like the one you have now, and I've seen photos of your land just today, is there going to be lasting damage that you as a farmer are going to have to correct before you can then replant on that land, even when it's dry?
Well, it's a great question. If your land is levee protected where there's no current, where the seep water or the rainwater that's accumulated behind the levee accumulates, usually not too much damage there. But if we have levee breaches or the river is channeled in a specific area, that land is not protected by a dike or a levee. We have a lot of scour erosion where a lot of the topsoil, if it's not protected with a cover crop, could potentially be lost. And in the last few years, seems to be the velocity of the rivers have been faster, and we've had more erosion in each flood that we've had recently.
I'm curious to get a point of view from each of you, and Arvin, I'll start with you. As far as putting in more barriers to flooding, you know, Don mentioned dikes and levees and crops, and you can use sandbags, and there are any number of different things you can do to try to mitigate flooding. Should Indiana and the people who own the land, especially the farmland and the land that's in low-lying areas or near rivers, be doing more as a preventive step to try to ensure that if you get a lot of rain, that you're not going to feel it as severely in the form of flooding?
Well, in short, yes. You know, I try to stay in my own lane here, and I certainly am not an engineer. So I will talk about what I do know. And I do know that we certainly don't need to continue to put structures in the floodways, in the areas that are prone to be flooded. I absolutely am a proponent of removing those structures. As far as putting up more barriers, certainly there is engineering that can go on and put up structures. The dams that have been built here in the state of Indiana have not only been great for flood control, it's always been great for recreation and economic development also. So in short, yeah, we certainly can build some barriers, but my mission here, Stan, certainly is just getting the structures out of the floodways and the flood